Well, it's been a bit of a break here between the second and third parts of my R5C ramble here, but we're finally going to get to that today. Kudos to all of you people out there getting great content out in a speedy manner. I mean, I've had the R5Cs now for well over a month, probably almost, 5 or 6 weeks or so. Used it a bunch. A lot of thoughts on it. I think what I say in part 3 here, I'm kind of at odds with that a bit now, but anyways, we're going to get that out the door. And hopefully I'll be back sometime sooner rather than later with something a little more tantalizing, a little more interesting. We'll see. On to media then. Now, actually, interestingly, Canon never does cameras, at least in the stills line, that have the same memory. And so the 1DX and I believe the 1DX3 were pretty much the only two cameras to ever have the same media, to have two card slots and then to have the same card slot. So the 1DX/1DC has two CF cards, compact flash card slots, and then the 1DX3 has two CF Express. So we've got CF Express and an SD UHS2 card slot on the R5C. That's great. We've got all this fast memory for the 8K and 8K60 and the 4K 120. But then you do have cheap media you can use for 4K. Now I've seen on the Canon site that the SD recording is available up to 650 megabits, which actually is not fast. And UHS2 cards, if they're utilizing most of the bandwidth, even allowing a bit for overhead there, they could hit way higher than 650 megabits per second. So cameras are actually rarely using all the potential bandwidth or memory speed available to them. The R5 here does have a UHS2 slot, but I use UHS1 cards, the SanDisk Extreme Pros. They top out at just over 80 megabytes per second. And if they're writing at 80 megabytes per second, well, times 8, that's 640. We're looking at 650 megabits per second from those cards anyways, potentially. And those cheap SD cards will happily handle the 480 megabit per second, or about 60 megabyte per second write speeds of this. And if you go through and look at the bit rates of the R5C, there are actually very few, outside of the RAW at least, very few of the bit rates that are above even 500 megabits per second. And so unless the camera does something intentionally and dumbs things down if it detects a UHS-1 card, there's no reason to believe that you wouldn't be able to use a pretty damn cheap and old SD card, UHS-1 card, to record even up to 4K 60 in the camera. So that could potentially be a cheap option. Power. Okay, it's been established that battery life on the camera is terrible. I'm going to use it gripped up, and so I shouldn't have too many problems in sort of the regular run and gun modes that I'll be using most of the time. That being said, if you want to be playing in the high-end 4K 60 world there and you want to have your autofocus and aperture and be going fully automatic like that, yeah, you're going to need something else. USB-C power delivery, to me, that's such a pain in the ass. I don't want to be doing anything, even if I have a cage or a cable clamp on the side there. This is just messy. Things get snagged, stuff happens. I've seen people with a battery bank in their pocket. Things happen. Arms get flung. You're hiking, you're tripping, you're doing stuff. I can imagine that in a studio, but out moving and doing something, I wouldn't want to be doing that. I think a much better option would be the dummy battery to DTAP. And then there is also an Anton Bauer DTAP to Canon 9-volt barrel cable, which connects to the Canon DR-E6C DC coupler. That'll run you about 263 beans. So it's a lot of dosh. But that is nice to know that we know that the regular battery port can actually handle the power, and that it's not like the camera has to draw from two sources, from both USB power delivery and from the internal battery. It can get the voltage it requires just from the internal battery. Should they have just stuck in a bigger battery, like a BPE 30? Well, that would have hurt the photo ergonomics, and that has to be why they didn't do it. They would have had to re-engineer the entire camera. It's a much bigger battery. All the cinema cameras have the battery stuck in the back and the bottom. It looks strange. It doesn't fit flush with the body. And like I mentioned earlier, they don't start from the ground up developing a camera for these hybrid lines. They take something they've got existing in their lineup and they add some flourish to it and add the sexy, sultry C. Now, should they have waited until the release of the R1 and then just use that as a base? Because judging from the voltage on the batteries in, say, the 1DC and the R3, these are, I think, 10.8, 11 volt batteries that surely would have provided the necessary voltage. That's a few volts more than the LPE6s provide. So maybe that would have done it. Maybe they were pressured to just push the camera out because of the offerings from other manufacturers out there. But yeah, going in a larger 1DC body could have helped alleviate some heating issues and power issues as well. And given us more room for ports on the side there. So maybe they just should have waited another year. C-Log2. It doesn't have the dynamic range. The sensor doesn't have the dynamic range. It's like asking why the 1DC doesn't have the same dynamic range as the EOS R or the R5. It's a different technology. It doesn't have it. The reason the C303 and C70 have such great dynamic range is because of the dual gain output sensor, the DGO sensor. C-Log2 was introduced with the C300 Mark II, I think. 15 stops of dynamic range in that sensor. They had to come out with C-Log2 in order to take advantage of the dynamic range that was available on that sensor then. It's just not there on the R5C. Yes, it can shoot RAW. Yes, when you open it in Resolve, it comes in as C-Log2, but that's just because Resolve doesn't know what it's doing. And it's just interpreting the footage. When it sees a Canon RAW file, it interprets it as such. It's RAW. You can apply whatever gamma you want to it. You know, you're shooting in Canon Cinema Gamut, you can do what you want. You can put Canon Log 3, whatever. IBIS. It is what it is. The video folks don't seem to mind. The photo people do mind. I wouldn't mind it for photos, but I've never had a camera with IBIS. I'll occasionally turn on the electronic stabilization with this if I'm not really going to be doing any panning and I'm going to be staying fairly steady. I make do with in-lens IS, or I have a tripod or monopod. Now, the video people who know much more about video than me and are strapping cameras to cars regularly say that, yeah, even if there is a method in place to, you know, even if you could lock the IBIS or turn it off, it's not really off because you've got a floating sensor and it's impossible to really actually fit it, fuse it to the body essentially like it is with this. It's in the chassis there. It would be nice if someone just came out and said, hey, we didn't do it because of the video people in these circumstances not wanting to have it, and also because coupling a floating sensor to a heat sink, yada, 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 for cooling is an issue. And yes, Sony has done it with a, damn, maybe the A1 does have IBIS with an 8K sensor. Well, there you go. But I mean, say the A7S3 or the S1H, those are 4K and 6K sensors respectively, I think. And there's a big pixel difference between 4K and 8K, even 6K and 8K. It's a hell of a lot more pixels. It's downsizing and stuff. But I guess, yes, Sony, I believe, has IBIS in the A1 with 8K video. Photo and video AF modes. So the R5 uses its one and only AF mode for photo and video, and it's damn good. Now, Canon cinema cameras like the C200 here do have a few other features, more focus speed adjustments and face only, which I'm unfortunately unable to use right now because I am too glassed and too bearded and the camera doesn't seem to recognize me. So I have it on not face only, but face priority with just a large center spot. Don't have a proper face. Now, people are saying, well, why the change? Who knows? But it could be that it's just not as easy as either combining or porting over the cinema style AF to the photo side or the photo style AF to the cinema side. Unless someone comes out and says why they haven't done it, or unless we don't soon get a firmware update that remedies that, then we may never know. Okay, now that we've taken a look at what the R5C offers and what it doesn't offer, now we can kind of go back to the 1DC and see if Canon learned anything over the intervening 10 years since that camera was released. In terms of ports, all they really added on the 1DC was a headphone monitoring port. On the R5C, we've had a time code, but really, yeah, in the cinema camera, regressing back to a micro HDMI port. I'm going to say they didn't learn anything. The mounting point situation, I think they really could have done something here. Would have loved to have seen a 3/8 and quarter 20 on the bottom there. Could have done it, Canon. NDs, it's small. No one's going to do it. It's fine. Audio options, yeah, they've done the Tascam thing. It's too small for XLRs, the body. In terms of audio, just adding that smart hot shoe, whatever it's called, and having that Tascam option, kind of even just opening it up. Canon opening something up like that to third-party manufacturers. Yeah, good for them. That's great. The hybridness of it, the market is going to decide whether or not 7 or 8 seconds between the two modes is too long or not, and whether the market wants completely differentiated menu systems like that. I am pretty sure I'm going to be for it. We'll see. But yeah, people are going to vote with their dollars, I guess. In terms of media, it's a bit of a mixed bag. The 1DC did have the 2 dual card slots. You could write photos to both. Couldn't write video to both. Video only to 1 card at a time. And they were very expensive back then. So these days you can likely, we'll see, if anyone knows, tell me, if you can get away with 4K 30, maybe even 4K 60 with the UHS 1 card. Of course, we've got all sorts of video options, writing to 2 different cards and all that, so that's nice. And of course, we've got the CF Express cards, which offer bandwidth for years to come. We're not going to run up against any limitations in the CF Express space for a number of years. Power, 1DC all the way. The R5C, of course, has more options in terms of power delivery and wall connectivity and stuff, easily available things. But again, I come back and I think maybe they just should have made an R1C. In terms of dynamic range, yeah, the sensor is miles better than what was available 10 years ago. IBIS didn't have it, doesn't have it. Do you need it in a cinema camera? Go and debate. It doesn't have it, so whatever. Autofocus, no. And yes, excellent autofocus. 2 modes, in fact, and all the customization options you could want. I believe it's the first cinema camera from Canon to have IAF. I don't think the C70 offers eye tracking. So there we go. Did Canon learn from their experiences with the 1DC when making the R5C? Actually, I don't think so. I really don't think they did much. I think most of what they did wasn't in response to any lessons learned from the 1DC, but it's just the way the market has pushed and pulled things, and they've got to compete with Panasonic and Sony and Nikon and who else is there? Pentax. So why am I thinking of purchasing this camera? Well, for me, it doesn't come down so much to image quality, really. I don't care too much about the 8K. I'll probably play with it a bit though, because it's somewhat fascinating. For me, the EOS R, when I bought it a couple of years ago, it was kind of meant as a stopgap because, like I mentioned earlier, it has too many limitations. I'm looking for a camera that will offer more of the best of both worlds. Even though this is small, I still like the way it fits my hand. It's much better with a grip. It complements all the Canon lenses I have and all the other Canon cameras I have. And it's offering things in both the photo and especially video modes that I'm lacking in this camera and that camera as well. Things that are just going to make it a little easier and a little more pleasurable to shoot, because for me, that's really what comes down to it. I'm used to a system. I enjoy using it. I have played around with some of the recent Sony cameras. They don't fit my hand nicely. The dials are in weird places. All that to say, if I spend enough time with it, I'm sure I'd learn it. But to me, really only the Canon is intuitive to pick up, and that's how it was back in 2008 when I was comparing between a 40D and a significantly more expensive D300, which is partly what swayed me to the 40D. But yeah, since then, it just fits my hand. It's a pleasure to use. And really, it's not worth it to go through other changes to get something else, because I know I can get the results that I want. And for me, the upgrade from this to an R5C is mainly due to familiarity with the Canon system, having Canon lenses, and liking the ergonomics. So those are my thoughts on the R5C. If you've got something to add, I guess hit me up below. And that was quite the ramble.